let's not romanticize it. Being a medieval assassin wasn't thrilling, poetic, or elegant. It was wretched. You didn't stride through shadows with perfect aim and a hidden blade under a sleek black cloak. You crawled through filth with a dull dagger, a price on your head, and the knowledge that success meant nothing except having to run faster afterward. The world didn't produce assassins, it broke them into existence. No child dreamed of growing up to slit throats for hire. No man with a future decided to become a ghost. The truth is simpler and crueler. People became assassins because they had nothing left to lose. Most of them were nobodies. Dirty-faced peasants with nothing but debts and desperation. Disgraced soldiers with shaking hands and dishonorable thieves with twitchy eyes who knew how to aim a rock or scale a rooftop without being noticed. And the rest? Ghosts. The kind of people who could walk into a village, commit a murder, and never even be counted in the census. If you had land, you didn't become an assassin. If you had a name, you were hiring someone else to get blood on their hands. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, had no family, no God left to fare, and a faint reputation for solving unpleasant problems, you were exactly what someone, somewhere, was looking for. And it always started the same way. A stranger in a cloak, a corner of a tavern that smelled like spilled beer and rotting secrets, a leather pouch that slid across the table. Inside a few silver coins, just enough to make you listen. Then came the whisper. A name. Never a nice one. Never Bob the Candlemaker. No. They wanted someone dangerous, someone who wore silk and slept behind locked gates, surrounded by guards, dogs, and guilt. You didn't say yes because you were brave. You said yes because you were hungry. Because that coin meant one more day alive. You didn't dream of becoming a legend. You prayed not to die like a dog in the gutter, holding your own intestines. And if by some miracle you made it through the job, you weren't rewarded. No title, no tale, no firelit praise. You got a bruise, a disease from the hay you slept in, and just enough coin to make the next week feel survivable. You were a tool, disposable, invisible, forgettable. And if you ever forgot that, you didn't last long. Let's set the record straight. There was no Assassin's Academy, no mountaintop monastery with cloaked monks whispering riddles while you practiced throwing knives at hay bales under the pale light of the moon. There was no ritual, no oath, no scroll passed down through generations. No one ever looked you in the eye and said, "Welcome, initiate. Here is your dagger. Here is your destiny." Because there was no destiny, there was only survival. And survival was your only teacher. If you were lucky, truly, lucky you, started with a bit of military experience. Maybe you held a spear during a peasant levy once. Maybe you watched your Lord's banner fall in a muddy battlefield and ran before the killing reached your end of the line. But most of the time, luck didn't get you far. Most assassins weren't soldiers. They were strays. Rats who knew how to climb. Wolves who knew when not to growl. Kids who learned, before they learned to read, that being seen meant being beaten. Or worse, you didn't learn in lessons. You learned in pain. You didn't have manuals. You had memories of jobs gone wrong. You didn't have you had ghosts. The first time you tried to kill someone, you made every mistake. You wore boots that squeaked. You stepped on floorboards that moaned like dying dogs. You thought, foolishly, that if you just held the blade steady and whispered a prayer, it would all go smoothly. It didn't. The man wasn't asleep. He was faking. He grabbed your arm halfway through the motion, screamed for the guards, and punched you so hard you bit through your own tongue. You got away, barely lost 2 teeth. Left a trail of blood across the stable yard. Spent the next week hiding in a sewer so foul even the rats looked at you with pity. But you lived. And that, as they say, was lesson 1. There were many lessons after that. None of them kind. You learned how to climb without using your hands too much. Because in the dark, it's not your grip that betrays you. It's your breath. It's your heartbeat. You learned how to step on stone without your soles clicking. How to open a latch without making it groan. How to cover your nose when you stab someone in the gut, so the stench of death wouldn't make you vomit beside the corpse. You learned to wait, and wait, and wait. Because sometimes the hardest part of the job wasn't the kill, it was the timing. You crouched in closets for hours. You lay beneath carriages, counting footsteps overhead. You once spent 3 days in a rooftop attic, chewing stale grain and pissing into a clay jar just to get one clean strike. And it still went wrong. Because the man didn't die on the first thrust. He knocked over a table, knocked out a tooth. You had to strangle him with the sash of his robe, while his wife pounded on the door and screamed for help. But again, you lived, and that was enough. Let's talk about tools. Forget the fantasy. No crossbows hidden in sleeves. No wrist blades that slide out with a flick. No throwing knives perfectly balanced and blessed by mystics. Your weapon was whatever didn't clank when you walked. Sometimes it didn't. A dagger, a garrote made from horsehair or unraveling rope, a vial of something nasty, hemlock, foxglove, powdered toadskin. Maybe you were never really sure if it worked. Sometimes it did. You didn't carry a sword, too long, too loud. You once knew a man who tried. He thought it made him look more dangerous. The guards heard him coming half a street away. They beat him with his own blade, then threw what was left of him in a pig trough, washed it with wine. You kept your gear close, light, quiet, tucked into seams, hidden in soles, tied inside hollowed-out loaves of bread. Once, you smuggled a dagger into a lord's banquet inside a cooked pheasant. You retrieved it in the privy, used it before dessert. As for poison, everyone loves the idea. Romantic, subtle, smooth. But in the real world, it's a gamble. Poisons were unreliable. You had no chemist, no lab, no little black book of dosages. You had roots you couldn't pronounce, mushrooms that killed or didn't, frogs that leaked strange fluids, and the knowledge that if you mixed it wrong, you'd be the one foaming at the mouth. You didn't have access to a noble's wine goblet. You had to bribe the cook, or sneak into the kitchen, or hope the stew pot was unguarded long enough to drop something in. But even then, nobles had food tasters, dogs, priests. You could spend 3 days preparing a dose that just made the victim burp, blink, and order another cup. And if they survived, guess who they'd blame? Not the cook, not the servant, you. The quiet man with twitchy eyes and a scar under his lip. And then came the worst part of all. Teaching yourself when not to kill. That was harder than the strike, because every job carried temptation. You're there, in the manor, in the bedroom. The target sleeps. But so does his mistress, his child, his steward, drunk and passed out by the hearth. You could kill them all. Tie up the loose ends. Cover your tracks in blood and be sure. But you don't, because more blood means more questions. More names for the town crier to shout as the sun rises and the torches come out. More trails. Restraint wasn't mercy, it was math. You killed who you had to, then you disappeared like smoke. Always like smoke. There was no graduation, no medal, no ceremony. You never got to say, I'm ready. You were never ready. You were just alive. Every job was a new hell. Every wall you climbed might break. Every blade you drew might stick in the bone. Every hallway you crept down might have a servant at the end, holding a candle and a scream. You didn't master the art, you survived the chaos. And that made you an assassin. Let's get something straight. No one hired you to kill simple men. You were never sent after the old man who sold candles or the drunk farmer who beat his horse. Those deaths could be done by any one thief's rivals. Angry sons. No. If someone came to you with a name, it was because the job was impossible. A merchant with guards and gold and layers of secrecy so thick it would take a week just to find which door he slept behind. And they wanted it done quietly, permanently, and without a trail. Your mark was always someone protected. A noble, a bishop, a captain. Killing the man wasn't the hard part. Getting to him was. Start with the guards. You didn't face 1 or 2 hired brutes. You faced dozens. Armed, alert, well-fed, men who lived for boredom, who prayed for something to stab, just to break the silence. They stood at the front gates, at the stables, at the stairs, in the halls. They didn't sleep all at once. They rotated, changed shifts with suspicious regularity, and some especially, the old ones, you learned to count steps, to memorize the rhythm of boots echoing on stone, to know that the captain with a limp paused every 16 strides to stretch his knee. You spent days learning creaks, which floorboards groaned, which hinges screamed, which locks stuck just slightly before opening. You learned to breathe with the wind, to hold your foot meter if the silence around you changed, to freeze like stone if someone so much as cleared their throat on the other side of a door. And even then, you weren't safe. The walls came next, because every man with power built himself a fortress, even if he called it a home. High stone, walls, murder holes, narrow corridors that funneled intruders into kill zones. Sometimes there were moats filled with water, or worse, with spikes. Sometimes both. There were arrow slits wide enough to put a bolt in your neck, but too narrow to see the bastard who fired it. There were false stairwells. Dogs. Oh God, the dogs. They didn't fall for your tricks. You could bathe in pig's blood and roll in ash, and they'd still smell you. Once, you tried poisoning the meat. The dog didn't eat it. You climbed a wall instead quietly, carefully, only to find the dog waiting on the other side. Watching, not barking. It didn't need to. The guard came running anyway. You still have the scar on your thigh from that night. And then there were the servants. People think servants don't matter. They think cooks and scribes and chambermaids don't notice things. That's a lie. Servants see everything. They notice when someone walks the hall who shouldn't be there. They notice when the guard at the back gate has bruised knuckles and a distracted look in his eyes. They know who brings the wine, who changes the chamber pot, and which boy feeds the birds at noon. They know faces, and they remember them. You couldn't fake being invisible in a place where everyone knew what invisible looked like. So you tried to blend in. You became a stable boy, a footman, a monk. You fetched firewood. You mumbled greetings. You stared at the floor. You cleaned horseshit and chamber pots just to convince them you belonged. But one wrong answer, one missed name. one forgotten prayer and the whole thing fell apart. One job sent you into a noble's manor disguised as a kitchen servant. You spent 4 days peeling onions until your fingers bled. You slept under a wooden table. You watched the mark come and go, attended by a jester with sharper eyes than any guard. You planned it on the 5th day. After the evening feast, when the mark would retire drunk and arrogant, you slipped into his room. You found his bed empty, because the real bed was a decoy. The real room was hidden through a sliding wall behind a painting of St. George. He didn't sleep alone. He rotated beds, sometimes even entire wings, depending on which direction the wind blew. You only survived because a mouse ran across your boot, and the jester's dog chased it, giving you enough time to roll under the bed and play dead. The jester left laughing. You left bleeding. Every target was paranoid, and for good reason. They lived surrounded by cousins with inheritance dreams, guards with grudges, lovers with secrets, and priests who heard things they shouldn't. They ate with tasters. They drank from their own sealed goblets. They carried charms, wore chainmail beneath their robes, and slept with a blade under their pillow. Some slept in rotating rooms every night, in a different location. Others had decoy servants dressed like them, sleeping in their bed. One bishop you were hired to kill faked his death every few weeks, just to weed out. He held mock funerals, wept at his own coffin, then snuck off to a villa with a new name and a new lover. You didn't get him. Someone else did. The rumor was he laughed as he bled, saying, "Finally, someone committed." And if you did manage to get close, if you finally reached the target, in the dark, with your hands steady and your pulse pounding, you had one chance. No second strike, no drawn-out struggle. It had to be perfect, fast, quiet, clean. One slice, one thrust. No screaming, no noise, no witnesses. Because if you made a sound, if the mark so much as wheezed too loudly, the whole manor would wake like a nest of hornets. You'd go from assassin to hunted prey in 10 seconds flat. There were no do-overs, no pause, no running unless the route was already planned. Every door, every tunnel, every loose tile on the roof. And don't forget the feasts. People think their ideal target's drunk, guards distracted. But so are you. The hall is packed. 50 men, 60 women, musicians, dogs, servants, drunken guests spilling wine and looking too closely. You're dressed as a servant, holding a tray, trying not to sweat. The mark is 3 paces away, laughing with roast duck in his mouth. You reach for the blade. Then he turns just slightly and you freeze. Because now, you're looking into the eyes of a 6-year-old girl standing beside him. His niece, his daughter, you don't know. But she sees you, and you see her, and in that moment, all the fear, the training, the cold logic, it falters. You pull your hand back, you bow, you vanish into the kitchen. You don't sleep for 3 days after that. Every target you faced lived like they knew they'd be killed eventually, and every structure around them, every brick, every man, every dog was built to make sure it wouldn't be tonight. But you had to try, because someone paid you, because you had no choice, because this was the only thing you were still good at. And you knew, if you failed, you wouldn't just miss the kill, you'd lose everything. Your face would be remembered, your name would be whispered, a bounty would be set, and the hunter would become the hunter, all because your mark had one guard too many, or because you sneezed, or because the floorboard creaked just a little louder than it should have. People think disguise is power, that once you slip into a hood, or robe, or uniform that isn't yours, you somehow become someone else. And it was a timer. The moment you put it on, a clock started ticking behind your back, and you never knew how fast the seconds would fall. Let us get this out of the way first. There were no tailor-made cloaks that flowed dramatically behind you, no black leathers, no enchanted cowls that wrapped you in moonlight, no masks designed to strike fear into hearts. You dressed in what you could steal. Peasant rags, monk robes, stable boy tunics, servant aprons, and walked into a manor carrying a satchel of blank paper, praying no one asked to see the seal. Once, you found the body of a courier outside a ravine, stripped the uniform off his corpse, and it worked until someone did. You stabbed him in the gut behind the wine cellar and left the satchel behind. After that, you carried real scrolls, forged when necessary, stolen when not, because disguise wasn't the lie. It was the pretense. The lie had to be in your face, your walk, your tone. You learned to copy posture. A page walks straight-backed, always looking up. A gardener stoops, hands curled as if still holding shears. A washerwoman keeps her eyes low, her shoulders slightly rounded from years of shame or submission. Every trade had a gait, a rhythm. Get it wrong, and someone notices. The cook wonders why you're not limping. The guard notices you don't salute. The maid scowls because you're holding the bucket like you've never touched one. Once, dressed as a chimney sweep, you forgot to smear your hands with soot. A boy in the hallway pointed and said, "His hands are clean." That was all it took. The steward sent men to find you. You were out the window and bleeding before they even knew what they were chasing. Sometimes, the disguise worked too well. You'd blend so thoroughly that you'd be stuck. You'd end up hauling manure. carrying firewood, scrubbing floors that stank of mildew and noble rot. You'd play the part so convincingly that you couldn't escape, because escaping meant breaking the illusion, and breaking the illusion meant attention. So you stayed, trapped in a role, living in someone else's skin, for hours, sometimes days, waiting for the moment, watching, smiling when expected, nodding in silence, not because you agreed, but because that's what a kitchen boy would do. Disguise was never foolproof. Even the best one could unravel with a single question. What's the name of the guard at the north gate? What happened to your left thumb? Where were you posted during the spring rains? They weren't interrogation questions. They were casual. The kind you were supposed to know the answer to. The kind that didn't sound dangerous until you realized you had no answer. Then came the silence. The stare. The slow blink of suspicion. Sometimes you could recover, smile, bow, say nothing, back away. Sometimes you had to stab the person asking, not because they were a threat, but because you were out of time. And let's talk about faces. You didn't get to cover them. Not really. Masks weren't a thing. Not for common folk. Only plague doctors, nobles at masquerades, or lepers got to walk around with their faces hidden. If you wore a mask, people didn't assume mystery. They assumed witchcraft, disease, danger. If you entered a room with your face covered, you might as well walk in holding a bloody dagger. You'd draw every eye. So instead, you wore expressions. Blank, submissive, distracted. You coughed if your voice might give you away. You squinted to hide the shape of your eyes. You pretended to be hard of hearing when the accent slipped. Once, you pretended to be drunk. Once, you pretended to be blind. Once you pretended to be dead very convincingly. In fact, until the guards turned their backs, you slipped away with a broken nose and a new appreciation for rigor mortis. But even if the disguise was perfect, Evan, if you looked the part, smelled the part, moved and breathed the part, you were still racing against time. Because familiarity is a killer. The longer you stay, the more people notice you. Not because you're suspicious, because you're new. The maid sees your face too many times. The guard begins to recognize your stride. The steward asks where you came from. And even though you've crafted a backstory, you forget that your accent doesn't match the region you claimed. Every second you're in disguise is a second someone might remember you later. And assassins can't be remembered. The worst moment, the one that still makes your skin crawl, was in a small coastal manor. Late autumn, you'd spent 2 days pretending to be a messenger, polite, timid, slouched like a servant. You delivered scrolls, waited tables, slept in the stable. The target was a minor noble, drunk most of the time, his guards lazy and soft. You had your opportunity lined up. He would bathe after supper. No guards in the chamber. No lock on the inner door. You were sharpening your blade on a belt strap when a boy approached, 10, maybe 11. Hair, the color of wheat, smiling like he knew you. He said, "You're not really one of us, are you?" Just like that. Not scared, not accusing, curious. Your throat went dry. You smiled, said something about being new. He nodded. "I thought so. Your boots don't match your coat." Then he ran off. You killed the noble that night. Sloppy work rushed. He screamed more than he should have. The guards heard. You fled with blood on your sleeves, shoes squelching through the mud, curses following close behind. You barely made it to the woods. Spent the next 3 nights sleeping in tree roots, listening to hounds baying in the distance. The boy, you don't know what happened to him. You never went back. You couldn't risk being recognized, because that's what disguise really was. A shell, not armor, not identity, just borrowed time wrapped around someone else's clothes. And when it cracked, even just a little, even one wrong word, one wrong glance, the shell collapsed. And the assassin underneath was left exposed, alone, and surrounded. So you got better, sharper. You watched 4 holes in your story. You sewed patches in borrowed cloaks. You carried crumbs in your pockets so you could sprinkle them on your shoulders. Because a kitchen boy should look like he eats where he works. You memorized regional dialects, practiced noble posture in a mirror made from pond water. You even learned to fake a limp after hearing that stable, hands in one town, always leaned to the left, thanks to the slope of the barn. You adapted. You changed. But the timer never slowed. Disguise gave you minutes, sometimes hours, never days. And when it broke, it always did. You had to become smoke, a whisper, a shadow through the window, a figure in the alley, a name half remembered by the terrified cook who thought he saw someone rifling the pantry. Disguise wasn't your weapon. It was your funeral shroud, temporarily borrowed and never meant to last. Because assassins don't wear masks. They wear time, and time always runs out. Here's the part that no one ever talks about. You can train your hands to kill. You can teach your body to move like shadow. You can learn to climb walls, hold your breath, vanish into crowds. But you can't teach your soul to survive the silence. Not forever. Because being an assassin didn't just mean being feared. It meant being forgotten. It meant letting go of your name, your past, your face, your voice, and eventually letting go of the people you once thought you could keep. At first, you thought you could manage it. Just do a few jobs. Keep your head down, get paid, disappear. You even let someone get close. Once her name was Ilsa, a weaver's daughter. Not pretty, not clever, but she laughed at your terrible jokes and brought you bread without asking why you were always bruised. She never asked where you came from or why you flinched when someone slammed a door. She just existed beside you, and for a while, that was enough. You didn't tell her who you were? Of course not. But you told her something, enough to make her think you were just another man trying to start over. She taught you how to stitch, how to sit still, how to speak softly around children. You began to believe maybe this could last. Then came the job. Remote. Easy mark, a former night-turned traitor hiding under a false name. Small village, you didn't know until after the kill that he was her uncle. The next morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye. Just a chair pulled out from the table and the sound of her name echoing in your mind like a death bell. You don't know if she figured it out, or if someone told her, or if it was just fate. But you never saw her again, and you never let anyone that close again either. Because relationships, they were weakness. They made you predictable. They tied you to places, to habits, to memories. And memories are death. You couldn't risk anyone noticing where you slept. You couldn't afford to be remembered by the boy at the market who saw you buy apples every Thursday. You couldn't afford the innkeeper asking why you always came back in spring. Even love was a risk. No, especially love. Because lovers ask questions. They notice bruises. They see bloodstains on your cloak. They wonder why you lock the door at night, why you sleep with your back to the wall, why you never truly sleep at all. So you stopped trying. You stopped speaking more than you had to. You drank alone, if at all. You never visited the same tavern twice in a week. You avoided anyone who looked at you with curiosity, that dangerous glimmer that meant they were starting to care or worse. To guess? You lived in borrowed spaces, slept in barns, moved with the weather. You became a drifter, not just across towns, but across identities. You were Thomas in one place, Brother Lucian in another, a mute stable boy somewhere else. Names became masks, each one thinner than the last, until even you stopped remembering which ones were real. You found peace only in isolation, the kind of peace that stank of damp wood, cold stew, and nights spent listening for footsteps outside your door. And you never stayed long, because someone always noticed. You noticed your scars, noticed the way you never let your cloak touch the floor, noticed how you always asked for a room with a back exit. Paranoia wasn't a condition, it was a skill, and it kept you alive. You didn't trust. Not the old man offering you shelter, not the child asking if you were lost, not the merchant smiling too warmly. Because you learned early that kindness was often a trap, sometimes literal. Once, a woman invited you into her home. She said her son was sick, that she needed help. She said she'd seen you around and thought you looked strong. She made stew, soft bread, offered you a warm corner by the hearth. The moment you leaned your head back, you saw it. The glint of blade, hidden in the woodpile. Her son wasn't sick. He was waiting outside with 3 men and a length of rope. You barely made it out alive. You killed one, wounded another. Ran so far your lungs felt like they were bleeding, and as you slipped into the woods, you realized she didn't want your kindness. She wanted your bounty. Someone had recognized you. Someone had whispered your name, and the warmth she offered had been bait. After that, you stopped eating food you didn't cook yourself. You stopped sitting near her. You slept under carts, in trees, in graveyards. You stopped answering questions altogether, and you stopped talking to strangers. Because in this life, everyone is a stranger, even yourself. The loneliness changed you. At first, it was sadness, then emptiness, then silence, so thick it became part of your bones. Your voice when you used it sounded strange, too sharp, too shallow, like it didn't belong to you. Your dreams stopped being dreams. They became repetitions, endless replaying of mistakes, familiar faces covered in blood. You began to wonder what your real laugh sounded like. You began to forget if you'd ever had friends, or if you just imagined them to pass the time. And the worst part, you couldn't even die with your name intact, because even if you did the job right, even if you vanished without a trace, you'd die alone, buried in an unmarked hole, your name known only to people who wanted you dead. No tombstone, no prayers, no one to say, he was here. Just wind, and dirt, and the whisper of a blade that never missed until the day it finally did. So, no, you didn't have friends, no love, no warmth, no safety. You didn't want witnesses. Because witnesses ask questions, and questions lead to names, and names lead to graves. You lived like a shadow, slept like a beast, feared like a ghost. And the longer you survived, the harder it became to remember what you were surviving for. Not peace, not purpose, just the next day, and the next, and the one after that, until even time stopped caring. People think assassins die in the dark, a silent blade, a twitch. That's a myth, a beautiful, merciful myth. Because the truth, when you failed, you died loud. You died choking, you died screaming. You died begging to be finished. You died with your name dragged through spit, blood, and mud until it sounded like a curse, even your own bones rejected. Failure wasn't rare. You could be the best, fastest hands, sharpest mind, quietest step and still make a mistake. The wind shifts, the guard rounds the corner too early. The door squeaks louder than it should. The dog doesn't sleep when it's supposed to. The noble rolls over and opens his eyes at the wrong moment, and suddenly, everything burns. The first thing that fails is your silence. You make a sound, a breath, a cough, a whisper too close to a candle flame. Someone hears footsteps, shouts, steel drawn from leather, and the hunt begins. You run. Of course, that's instinct. Through halls you thought you memorized, over stairs you thought you counted, under archways where every shadow could be death wearing boots. You leap windows, crash through kitchens, knock over servants, and spill boiling stew on your own legs. You don't stop, you don't think, because thinking slows you down. And right now, speed is your only hope. But they're everywhere. Guards, dogs, cooks with cleavers, and drunk noble sons with something to prove. The halls you've crept through in silence just hours ago now echo with pounding boots and roars of there into the stables. And worse than the shouts are the bells, because once the bells start ringing, those damn iron-throated bells that scream across rooftops, not just a thief. You're not just a murderer, you're an enemy of order, an infection to be burned out. And the whole town turns against you. You try the roof, they block the alleys, you slip into the sewer, they flood it, every route you thought would save you. They know them, because you're not the first. There were others. And most of them failed too. If you're caught, it's worse than death. They don't just hang you. They don't just slit your throat. They make a spectacle of you. They drag you through the square, sometimes tied to a horse, sometimes naked, always bleeding. They display you. They let the crowd spit on you, throw rotten fruit, rocks, fists. They strip away your disguise, piece by piece, until you read nothing but the trembling truth beneath it all. And then they get creative. One assassin had his hands crushed first, so he could feel what it meant to lose the tools of his trade. Another was stuffed into a cage, barely big enough for a dog, and hung from the castle walls. He lasted 3 days. The crows took his eyes on the second. There was a woman, once young, beautiful, quick. They caught her trying to poison a steward's wine. They flayed her. Not quickly, not mercifully, in strips, while the nobles watched from velvet cushions and the children laughed like it was a puppet show. You tell yourself you'll die better than that. You say, if they catch me, I'll bite my own tongue off. I'll take poison. I'll leap into the river. You prepare for it, rehearse it. You hide a shard of glass in your sleeve, a tiny thorn dipped in belladonna sewn into your cuff, a pouch of ash to blind your pursuers just long enough to jump. But when it happens, when your blood is in your eyes, and your leg won't work, and they're dragging you backwards by your hair, you forget all of it. You scream, you beg, you bleat, and the city swallows you, like it swallowed every assassin before you. And the worst part, you weren't even the only one that night, because the powerful rarely trust just one blade. You were plan A. Some other poor bastard is already climbing the wall as you bleed in the gutter. And if he succeeds, they'll still kill you. But they'll lie about it. They'll say you confessed. Say you served a rival noble, or a foreign king, or the devil himself. They'll say they saved the city from your wrath. You'll become a story, a warning. Your failure will be printed in pamphlets, sung in pubs, recited in sermons. And none of it will be true. But there are worse fates than death. Because sometimes you survive. Not because you escaped, but because they wanted you alive. For questions, for names, for revenge. And that's when the real work begins. They keep you in places where the sun never touches the floor. In pits, in holes, in towers, where no one sings, and every stone is colder than the last. They ask once, then twice, then again, and every time, they take something from you. A finger, a truth, a piece of memory you didn't know could bleed. They break bones that never heal, right? They tear out things that don't grow back. They use tools with names, tools passed down like heirlooms from one torturer to the next, and if some who survive all that, they make sure you never walk straight again, or think straight, or sleep without hearing the door creak and thinking it's your own executioner, come late. You live in the back of a cart, or, beneath a bridge, you eat what dogs reject. And still someone might recognize your face, and still they might come for you, because once you've failed, the scent of that failure never leaves your skin. It sticks. So you pray, if you ever pray at all, that when your time comes, it comes clean, it comes quiet, it comes fast, that your blade hits right, that your breath stays silent, that the blood sprays away from your face, not into it, that you escape. and disappear, and that your name is never shouted by guards from rooftops, while bells scream your sin across stone. Because if you fail, you will not be remembered with fear, you will be remembered with laughter, and that is a worse death than any blade could offer. The blade lands, the blood runs, the body falls, and for 3 precious seconds, the world holds still. That's when it hits you. You did it. You survived. You're not bleeding. The knife didn't slip. They didn't scream. The guards are still asleep. The bells haven't rung. It worked. But there's no victory, no glory, no moment to breathe, because assassins don't win. They escape. And that's a very different thing. You don't pause to admire your work. You don't look back. You don't whisper prayers over the corpse. You wipe the blade fast. You check the floor for prints. You close the door quietly behind you. And then you run, but not loudly, not in boots. You glide down stairwells, over stone, through servants' passages that smell of mildew and spoiled meat. You don't panic, not yet, because you've done this part before. The exits were mapped. The guards counted, the weather checked, every door, every path, every angle. You planned for this, but the house, the city, the world, it moves, and you have to move with it. There's always something you didn't expect. The guard who wasn't drunk, the storm that hit an hour early, the child in the hall who wasn't supposed to be awake, you pass him. He blinks, he doesn't scream, but, you know, he'll remember. One more ghost in your trail. Sometimes the hardest part isn't the manor, it's the town. You were a shadow indoors. Out here, you're just another face in a place that knows its own people. The baker's boy will squint. The fishmonger's dog will bark. The old woman with a good memory and bad teeth will say, "I've never seen you before." And that's all it takes. One voice, one suspicion, one guard who hears too much. And suddenly, you're not escaping. You're fleeing. You switch alleys, you steal cloaks, you knock over carts and crawl through sewage drains that stink of old blood and rat piss. You don't look at the stars, you don't look at the faces, you don't even look at your own hands, because the moment you do, the moment you believe you made it, you'll die. You don't stop until you're outside the city, until the lanterns are a faint glow behind you, until the dogs are howling at something else. Even then, you don't rest. You walk for hours, feet blistered, eyes raw, legs trembling. You don't head for the next town. That would be predictable. You head for the swamp, the cliffs, the woods, where no sane man lingers, because safety isn't in civilization. It's in being forgotten. But you don't forget. Your mind replays it. The marks, final breath, the weight of the purse, the way the candlelight caught the edge of your blade like it was hungry. You try to sleep, you try to eat, you manage neither. When you do find a bed, it's not yours, it's straw. It's wet, it creaks when you move, so you don't move. And when you close your eyes, you hear the guard's boots behind you again. You hear the servant gasp. You hear your name in a whisper that sounds too much like a curse. And even days later, when you're far, far away, when you change your clothes, your name, your accent, you still feel watched. The forest is too quiet. The town too polite. The girl at the tavern smiles too much. You start to wonder, was it a trap? Are they testing you? Did someone see you in the mirror? You leave by morning. You always do. Because even if you lived, you never stopped running. People assume the job ends with the kill. It doesn't. The job ends when no one remembers it happened. And even then, only sometimes, because the truth is, your face is out there now. You were seen, or heard, or guessed. Your hands smell like blood no matter how many times you wash them. In every street you walk down, every eye that lingers 1 second too long. You wonder, do they know? Is this the place it ends? You change clothes 5 times a week. Hair, posture, speech, you invent a new past each morning and bury it by sundown. You become a ghost wearing flesh. You sit in taverns and listen to your own crime being told by drunk strangers. Sometimes the names are wrong. Sometimes the story is warped. But they always get one thing right. You were never meant to be caught. You were too good. You didn't make mistakes. You vanished. But you're still out there, drinking stale ale, eating stolen apples, sleeping on floors that itch with lice and mold, because you know better. They're not telling the story because they respect you. They're telling it because they're still looking, and they always will be. The bounty might fade, but rumors, they're immortal. And so, in a way, so are you. But not in the way you want it. Sometimes, a letter arrives. A name, a new target, more coin. You stare at it for a long time. You remember the last run, the chase, the burn in your lungs, the way your hands wouldn't stop shaking even after the kill. And still, you say yes, because you have nothing else. Because you were made for this. Because you don't know how to be anyone else anymore. So you pack your blade, and your cloak, and your silence, and you start running again. Not away, but toward. There's a truth about this life that you learn early, or you die young. People don't care who dies just, who profits. You kill a noble, fine, as long as his lands pass cleanly to the next. You kill a merchant. Acceptable. If his debts die with him, you kill a priest. Tolerated, if the bishop hated him anyway. Because everyone, in this world, has a price on their head. Whether it's spoken, aloud, or whispered in coin, under a tavern table someone wants them gone. You were just the blade that answered that desire. But sometimes, someone gives you the wrong name. And that's when everything collapses. It happened only once. Once was enough. You were paid in gold more than usual. No haggling. No demands. Just a name, a sketch, a location, and a date. She lived alone. Upper floor of a merchant's house. Taught letters to noble girls during the day. Prayed alone at night. You watched her for 3 days. She walked with a limp. Wargrey spoke softly to birds and cats like they were friends. She smiled at children. Never locked her door. You assumed the worst. Maybe she poisoned him. Maybe she was a spy. Maybe she was the kind of gentle no one suspected until it was too late. So, on the 4th night, you entered her home. No guards, no traps, no witnesses. You slipped through her window. She didn't scream. She only said, "Oh, you've come." There was no fight, no plea. She stood there in a candlelit room, wearing nothing but sleep and sadness. And she looked ready. You asked her name? She gave it. It matched the parchment in your coat. You asked if she knew why you were here. She said, "I think so, but I hoped I was wrong." You told her she could leave. She said, "I did. Once." It wasn't enough. And then she closed her eyes. You'd never hesitated before. Not once. But your hand shook that night, because everything about it felt wrong. But you did it, because hesitation is lethal. And you weren't ready to die. You buried her behind the bakery. No one found the body, but someone found out anyway. 3 nights later, you woke to a dagger at your throat and 5 words that would echo for the rest of your life. Do you know what you did? They didn't kill you. That would have been too easy. They left you broken, cut your face, broke your ribs, burned the contract into your back. They wanted you to remember, not just the mistake, but who paid for it. You spent months tracking the employer. Turned out he wasn't a noble, not a rival, not a jealous lover. He was just a bored, lordling drunken coin and cruelty who once proposed marriage to the girl, was rejected, and wanted her erased. She wasn't a traitor. She wasn't a spy. She was just someone who said no, and you killed her. After that, everything changed. You started asking more questions, watching longer, doubting your instincts. But that made you slower. And in this trade, slower means dead. So you stopped taking contracts with vague motives. You refused targets who didn't make sense. And that's when the second lesson came. No one cares until it's the wrong person. And everyone's the wrong person to someone. You killed the magistrate. Once corrupt, cruel. Everyone hated him. But he was the cousin of a duke. And the duke, he didn't care about the magistrate. He cared about the message, that anyone could be killed. So he hired 20 men to burn the city block you'd been spotted in. Just to make a point. You weren't even there. But 43 people died because you killed the wrong man. The worst part, you never know who's wrong until it's over, because death reveals secrets. That innkeeper who spat on peasants, turns out he was protecting runaway slaves in his cellar. That merchant who bribed the guards, turns out he was funneling gold to fund an uprising that Matov changed everything. That girl who smiled at cats, she once saved the king's life and told no one. And you were just a hand holding a knife, a weapon swung by liars. So you start seeing ghosts. You wake up in ditches and swear you hear their voices. You pass through towns and feel their eyes in every doorway. You start dreaming of people you didn't even kill, but whose deaths you caused. Because when you kill the wrong person, you don't just become a murderer. You become a story, a legend, a scar in the pages of lives you'll never read. You thought you were a weapon. Now, you're a curse. They whisper about you like you're a spirit, a judgment, a plague in human skin. And some believe in justice. Some believe in revenge. But all of them believe this. No one is safe when you are near. And that is its own kind of death. So you change again. New name, new scars, new rules. You don't ask why. You don't ask who. You just say no to more jobs than you take. You disappear for months at a time. Live in forests. Drink rain. Talk to birds because they don't lie. And you try, very hard, not to remember her face. But you always do. And some nights, you think you hear her whisper, "I hoped I was wrong." You kept telling yourself it was for balance. That every man you put in the ground was worse than you. That what you had to do was justified. Maybe it started that way. Maybe your first kill was noble. Maybe he was a monster in silk, and you were the shadow of justice with a blade in your hand and righteousness in your chest. But that didn't last. Because soon the names got murky. The reasons thinner, the lies thicker. And you didn't stop. You just learned to stop asking. Because you weren't the sword of justice. You weren't vengeance. You weren't anything holy. You were a message. A message written in bruises, carved in ribs, whispered by men who bled out with your hand on their mouth and your name never spoken. You tried to lie to yourself, tried to believe that you were saving people, tried to convince yourself that every body you left behind prevented something worse. But eventually, something changed. You saw fear in the eyes of good men. You saw children pulled away when you walked by. You saw mothers step between you and their sons with trembling hands, not because they knew you, but because they felt you. And that was when you understood. You weren't a hero. You were a warning. You were what parents whispered about when their sons wanted to run away. You were the shadow behind a merchant's door when he cheated someone too dangerous. You were the shape behind a priest's eyes when his sermons dipped into forbidden truth. You were never the subject of the story. You were the end of it. The curtain fall, the closing line, the red mark that turned fiction into fear. They called you many things. The knife in the wind, the last door, the one who came without sound. You didn't choose those names. You didn't want them. But they stuck. Because nothing sticks like fear. And you weren't respected. You weren't admired. You were remembered because they were afraid to forget you. Because forgetting might invite you back. Sometimes people would recognize you. Not by face, never that. You were careful. But by silence, by posture, by the cold that followed you into rooms, the way candles flickered when you passed. They'd say nothing. They'd look away. They'd pray. Not for you, for themselves. Because you weren't someone people protected. You were someone they bargained with.
You stopped staying places long. You stopped giving names at all. Because every name you gave became cursed, not because they betrayed you, but because they dared to stand near you. A farmer who once offered you bread was found hanged in his barn a week later. A boy who asked you your name was beaten in the streets. A woman you never even touched was burned alive when they thought she harbored a creature of darkness. You didn't kill them. You didn't even try. But they died anyway, because your presence alone was a sentence, and that guilt never washed off. You were alone in every crowd. Unarmed in every room, unwanted in every prayer. You stopped sleeping in beds. You stopped walking in daylight. You stopped existing in the ways people understood. You became a myth still breathing, but not truly living. And deep down, you accepted it, because if you couldn't be loved, if you couldn't be forgiven, at least you could be feared, and fear was the only currency that never ran out. You'd walk into a tavern and hear the music stop. You'd ask for ale and be given wine. You'd rest in the stables while the horses whimpered and refused to eat. You didn't need to explain yourself. You didn't need to threaten. They knew. Not who you were, but what. Then came the imitators, the boys who dressed in black and whispered they were like you. The thieves who left daggers indoors. The drunk mercenaries who claimed your kills, told stories with your shadow over their tongue. And they all died. Because your world wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a stage. It wasn't a myth. It was blood and teeth and corners so dark they swallowed you whole. And every fool who tried to become you was buried quickly and quietly. Because if there's one thing people feared more than seeing you, it was seeing someone try. You once met a boy maybe 13 who begged you to teach him. He said his father beat him, said he wanted to be strong, said he wanted to kill bad men. You looked at him, saw his bruises, saw the anger, saw yourself before the years broke you, and you told him the truth. You said, "This life isn't about justice. It's about dying without anyone to bury you." He cried, ran. You never saw him again. And you hope, even now, that he lived a quiet life, that he grew old, that he never remembered your face, because if he did, he might have tried to follow you. And there's only one ending to that story. So no, you weren't a hero. You weren't the savior in anyone's tale. You weren't the answer. You were the consequence. You were the breath before the scream, the silence before the fall, the space between mercy and justice where only the desperate dared to live. You weren't remembered with songs. You were remembered with silence. And that's what made you dangerous, because legends can be fought, but silence spreads.
You thought, once, that all of this would end, that one day, you'd put down the blade, bury the cloak, find a quiet village, maybe by a river, where no one knew your name. You imagined fishing in the mornings, listening to wind in the trees, learning how to laugh without watching the door. But you were a fool, because men like you don't grow old. You don't settle. You don't fade. You rot from the inside, slowly, quietly, until the person you were becomes a story even you can't remember telling. It starts with little things. You forget your real name. You forget your birthday. You forget what it felt like to hold something without fearing it might turn into a weapon. You wake up in towns you don't remember traveling to. You answer two names you didn't give yourself. You stare into polished iron mirrors and see a face that no longer belongs to you. The lines are too sharp, the eyes too flat. You don't blink the same way other people blink. You've been too close to death. Too long, and some of it rubbed off it wasn't supposed to be like this. You were just trying to survive, but somewhere along the way, in the blood, and the lies, and the running, you crossed over. You stopped being a man with a blade. You became the thing the blade worships. You learned how to disappear from locked rooms. You learned how to move without sound, even on broken glass. You learned how to kill with anything: needle, stone, spoon, a wet cloth. You could read people faster than they could speak. You knew if a guard was bluffing by how they You knew if someone was about to betray you by the way they touched their own throat, and you stopped feeling guilt. Not because you stopped caring, but because caring was a crack in the wall, and you couldn't afford to let light in anymore. People say death wears a black robe. No, death wears whatever keeps it breathing. Sometimes it wears a farmer's coat, sometimes a monk's robe, sometimes a girl's smile, sometimes nothing at all but the cold stillness of someone who no longer needs to explain themselves. That's you now. You don't need a reason. You don't need a plan. You don't even need a name. You walk into places, and the air changes. You don't speak. You don't threaten. You just exist. And that's enough. Because you've become the final step in a story that only ends in silence. But even death has rules. And you, somehow, broke them. You lingered. You didn't vanish. You kept coming back. And so now, the stories are different. They don't just fear you. They hunt you, not to kill you, but to prove they can. Because if death can bleed, if death can be caught, then the world makes sense. Again, you hear the whispers of bounty hunters, of Templars, of kings who want your skull on a pike to remind people that even shadows cast light when burned. And you laugh, not because it's funny, but because if they really understood what you've become, they'd run, they'd beg, they'd hide behind gold and fire and faith, and it wouldn't save them. Because death doesn't knock, it creeps in. It waits, it smiles with your teeth. You've outlived all your clients, all your enemies, most of your memories. The world has changed. The streets are new. The guards wear polished armor and don't fear ghosts anymore. But some of them still flinch when they hear your name. Not because they believe, but because something deep in their blood does. Some fear is inherited. And you're the ancestor of dread. The reason mothers keep knives by the bed. The reason doors are barred even when no one is near. You're not alive anymore. Not really. You're a force. A caution. A shape. A blade without a handle. A scream without a mouth. A legacy, too sharp to hold, too ugly to forget. And you walk still, not because you want to, not because you can't stop, but because death doesn't get to choose when it rests. So now, when you kill, it's not for gold, not for coin, not even for cause. You kill because someone whispered your name into the wrong shadow. You kill because a child once saw your eyes and didn't look away. You kill because the world won't let you leave, and you've forgotten how. There's a hill somewhere south of nowhere, where you once said you'd go to die. You pass it every few years. Never stop, because stopping is surrender. And you're not ready, not yet, because somewhere out there is the last name, the one written not on parchment, but in smoke, not by a man, but by time itself. Your name, and when it comes, you'll smile. You'll close your eyes, you'll let go, not because you were hunted, not because you were beaten, but because, for the first time, you were finally free.